Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're joining us from. My name is Abhijit Bhaduri, and I work as an upskilling and branding coach. I work with individuals. I help them discover their entire career plan, what lies ahead, what they want to do. Sometimes it just helps to talk to somebody else. And I also work with organizations to identify their talent strategies and their branding strategies. With that said, today's conversation is really all about the art of writing. Many a times, people who are interested in writing, publishing their own stories, whether fiction or non-fiction, both genres, when we hear from people, I try and share with them what has been my learning. And then I kind of think that I haven't actually done that much of publishing to be able to give somebody some kind of sage advice. But what I definitely like to do is to therefore introduce you to somebody. I'm going to start by really reading out all the titles, just so you know this is the entire body of work that the person has done so far. Let's start with this. Anuradha Kumar's books I'm going to read out: Across the Seven Seas, A Chola Adventure, How Did the Harappans Say Hello? That was quite interesting. I thought that I would love to know more about that. Chanakya, the Kingmaker and Philosopher. Her Name Was Freedom. Sarojini Naidu, the Nightingale and the Freedom Fighter. Fantastic Birds and Beasts, which is there in Myth Quest. So these are all the mythological creatures. The life of Subhash Chandra Bose. You have Atisa, the Kings and Queens of India, In Search of Kalidas, Atisa and the Seven Wonders. More about those divine creatures like we saw first in Myth Quest. Then you have Swami Vivekanand. Then you have the mighty Asuras, the vehicles of the gods. This series sounds pretty interesting. And this, of course, I want to take a little pause and so we'll talk about this in a little more detail. The Kidnapping of Mark Twain. This is Anuradha's latest book. And this is really what I thought that, wow, here is a person who's written so many books. We should have her come and talk to you. So, and then, of course, there are other stories for Paul. That was the other one. She's written about the girl who ran away in a washing machine and other stories. How fascinating was that title itself? Inspector Angrez and the Pizza Delivery Boy, Emperor Chandragupta. It takes a murder. So you can see her straddling many different genres. The Emperor Harsha and Coming Back to the City, Mumbai Stories, The Hottest Summer in Years, The First Train, and of course, ladies and gentlemen, introducing Anuradha, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being here, and it's so lovely to actually see you after so many years. For the benefit of the listeners, the backstory of this conversation is that Anuradha, we first met when I was teaching at XLRI, and Anuradha was in the class which was there. She will tell you how much she hated my teaching.
Training,
Not today.
yeah, training and development. I still remember the second year, next year, fifth semester. Yeah, and I got a good grade, by the way.
I have no doubt because, you were a really dedicated student and, very diligent. So, I learned more than what I taught. That was the sign that, I said, this person deserves a good grade. And you had a master's in history, if I remember right. So, master's in history, then you went to XLRI and did a specialization in, at that point of time, human resources. And then you also, at a later point of time, I know you did a master's in fine arts, which you did. We'll come to that. But if I remember right, after XLRI, you had a spate of job changes. Talk to me about that.
Yeah, first, thank you, Abhijit, for having me on your wonderful show. Yeah, so when I passed out from Excel, I had 3 job offers, and finally I went to Ahmedabad and I worked for Torrent Pharma. Yeah, in 1994-95, Ahmedabad was an interesting city, and because I'm also a student of history, I tend to look at things like that, what it was before and after that. But yeah, so and I left Torrent and I worked for some management consultancies like Ferguson's, A. Ferguson and Price Waterhouse. I worked for Times of India in the HR department. I worked for Birla Consultancy. And there are even places where I worked for just 15 days and I just walked out. I mean, on a whim because, I was young. I have that excuse that I was young and one could make mistakes or whatever. But maybe that kind of life didn't appeal to me. And then finally, somehow, by a strange quirk of fate or stroke of luck, I came back to writing because I did do the occasional writing, like one writes for school magazines and college magazines. But it was the most interesting thing, like when I believe in some kind of miracles, sometimes magic happening in your life, the way I came back to writing when I thought that I'd been a complete failure in everything. It made me believe in magic because I saw this small advertisement in the Times of India about a place looking for writers, and I applied and I got through. Salary was much less. There was much less glamour. That way I came back to writing after 5 years in the corporate world. 5 years, 10 jobs. That's how I look at it. So every 6 months I would change a job.
Torrential shifts is probably the best way to sort of say it. So torrent was quite descriptive of those next 5 years. And
yeah, quite apt. Yeah, torrential and turbulent. Yes.
when you joined Economic and Political Weekly as a writer, what drew you to that role? Because you did have, an opportunity to write about in a completely different space altogether.
Yeah.
What was that experience like?
So when I was a student at Delhi University doing my master's, the EPW was one magazine we studied because that had the latest research, a lot of historical articles and essays written by all the foremost historians of that time and even now. When I was in Bombay, it's very easy to talk like this in hindsight because I have 20 years. I have a 20-year period to look back on what I did right and what I did wrong. Most of it wrong, of course. So in 1999, a friend of mine from Delhi University days, he just said that, why don't you just go to EPW and see if you can do book reviews or something for them. I just called up the office and the editor answered, and he was surprisingly encouraging. I thought he would be very standoffish and very snooty because this was his big academic publication and catering to people who lived in the higher strata and analyzed society. But that was Krishna Raj, and I've written about. He was surprisingly encouraging. I mean, I don't know what he saw in me. I really like being with books and reading them, and out of the blue he gave me this job as an assistant editor in EPW, and that's where I lasted actually for about 8 years. Right at the beginning, besides editing, the assistant editors would even have to write one of the editorial columns, and that involved a lot of reading up, learning about India's recent history, post 1947 and beyond. That kind of background I think helped my later writing and research in history, because I had sort of background in pre-independent Indian history from my days in university. But being in the EPW and that habit of trying to look at sources, learning to recognize the proper sources, because nowadays there's this whole controversy about what source actually is telling you the real story, that kind of discretion, the judgment, the perception. That I think EPW taught me. I made mistakes there too, but EPW was one place that forgave me my mistakes and helped me learn. And that's an important thing I learned, that in the corporate world, maybe it was just me. I found that one slipped up and did mistakes and one had to pay a price. But in the EPW, I was forgiven and I learned from those mistakes. I mean, that's what I took back with me. And of course, this love for research and writing. If it hadn't been for Krishna Raj and the EPW, I don't think I would have managed to do this much.
When I graduated from XLRI, my degree was in personnel management, and itself has changed. The name of XLRI has changed, so it is no longer Xavier Labor Relations Institute as it was at that point of time. It's different now. The field itself, evolved from training and development to learning, and the focus on talent management, and all of those shifts that have happened, the emergence of possibilities, new sectors, new kind of roles. I mean, the role of a chief learning officer didn't exist when I was teaching there. So much changes. I think it is quite legitimate to have the kind of things that, you try out many different things in rapid succession before you decide that, okay, this is what I like, and then you refine it. So when you deconstruct what you said, you studied history in your master's degree, but that was pre-independence history. When you worked at Economic and Political Weekly, it gave you a chance to do post-independence, modern history. When did you start thinking about your first book? What was that experience? Talk to me in detail about the idea that came to you and how did you turn it into a book?
Like most things, it is quite accidental and entirely by serendipity. It also coincided with the rise of the internet. When I first started writing these short stories, I have to tell you, I used to get so bored in my corporate life. I remember in Torrent, I wrote a short story when I was supposed to be doing something else. So I used to do this kind of stuff. And then the internet took off in a big way in the late 90s. You had all these browsers like Alta Vista, and of course there was Yahoo. And I did these online magazines. There was something called Indolink, which used to cater to the diaspora, the growing diaspora in India and the US. And maybe there was nobody submitting to that place. So I sent my stories there and they accepted it. So I thought, oh wow, I thought there must be something I'm doing right. I mean, so those were days of complete naivety. So I started with short short stories, and my first book was published by Writers Workshop, which isn't mentioned there because Writers Workshop has a name because it published all the big Indian writers. At one time, Vikram Seth and Chitra Banerjee, Deva Kuruni was published by Professor Lal at Writers Workshop. So he published me also, and this was 2002. Then I went with this book of short stories to Kiran Nagarkar, the writer. I had this correspondence and conversation with him because remember these are the early days of the internet, okay, and the mobile phones had not invaded our lives to such a great extent. So one could actually email, one could actually ring up a person, and they wouldn't mind. And that's what I did with Kiran Nagarkar. So I used the pretext of one of essay or one of his books appearing in the EPW, and I called him up, and then quite brazenly I asked him to look at one of my short stories. And he said that, you should be more ambitious and try a novel. Okay, so I looked clueless because I thought I didn't have it in me to write a big thing like a novel. Where does one begin with a novel? And he just randomly suggested that, did someone ever make you really angry when you were young? And that struck a chord, because in childhood and adolescence, emotions are so raw and you feel things a lot more deeply, right? And those early memories stay with you and they are magnified to a great extent. That things that you are afraid of as a child, somehow they look so magnified and amplified that you do believe in ghosts and demons, somebody hiding under your bed and a creature looking fierce. So I mean, those kind of things, and somebody who's bullied you or who's been tyrannical, they really appear monsters. And so what he said, I think it got to me in a strange way, and I just started writing that novel, getting up early in the morning before I went to work at the EPW. And in the first 3-4 months, I had a draft, a draft of sorts. And I revised it a couple of times at best, okay? And then again, quite brazenly, I asked people like Pankaj Mishra, who's quite a big thing these days, to look at it, and the late Shama Fateh Ali, who was one of my earliest mentors, and I miss them all actually. I think I was lucky at that stage to get them to look at my writing and suggest things. And then I started sending it out to publishers, big time publishers, and I got rejected royally by almost everyone, like Penguin, couple of the others. Ravi Dayal used to be big that time. I sent it to Ravi Dayal also. But I kept getting rejected. I think from 2002 till 2004, 2 years, I must have picked up a spate of rejections. I think for a writer, that's one thing to get used to, no? Not just the rejection, but also the ridicule. Because there were people in my office, I mean, they're all good friends. People in my office who would laugh at my effort. That what am I trying to do? Taking out these printouts and sending them all the time, couriering them to publishers and stuff. There must be a certain resilience also to see through that, To be very honest, I had family support. There was my husband who was supporting me both emotionally and financially. So I guess it took a spate, I think, time of from 2002 to 2006. It took 4 years for my first novel to be published, Letters for Paul. And after that, I think I really took it more seriously. So in every phase of my writing life, there's been, with every book, I've tried to, aim higher and learn more and do something more. That's how it's gone on. I mean, in the end, actually, I wanted to make something good of my own life and to make the world happy. Those two things. Otherwise, I don't think there's any point in writing or to be a writer.
You talked about something which is very hard for most people, and it's never easy that when you write something, you kind of, it's almost that, you put a little bit of yourself into, not a little bit, I think you put a lot of yourself into writing. Therefore, I always think writing is a little bit like cooking or any of the performing arts. When you do that, you perform a dance. And if somebody says, oh, that was terrible. I mean, when you get a rejection letter, it's it's not good enough. It's terrible. And I'm, someday we'll exchange stories about all the, really disheartening pieces of rejection letters we got. And I wish I had kept some of them because some of them were really, terribly disheartening.
Yeah.
You have that. I mean, but imagine that, when somebody does that, it seems that somebody rejected you, not just your writing, you.
True.
Yes. How do you recover from that?
Yeah, that's an interesting question because obviously all writers are vulnerable because you have to be thin-skinned to to let the world seep into you. If you're not thin-skinned, then you can't be alive to the sensations and feelings and to people around you, right? But you also need to develop a certain thick skin and also faith in your abilities. Somewhere I had that blind faith that, if I just work hard, just think only of the writing and try to get better at it sentence by sentence. This is all a belated realization. It might sound like some wise sage advice. I realized that one has to work at writing sentence by sentence, learning to use the right word, getting into the skin of a character. And that will finally work. That will touch someone. I mean, there's no way it is not going to touch someone. You'll get a lot of rejections, a lot of cruel rejections. Most of the rejections are actually indifferent. You just get a polite, it's not part of our list or something like that. Yeah. But somewhere I think one person out of thousands, if you just reach that person, you've done something.
We get that letter, and there are many versions of this letter, and I can share. Some of them will see, like some of them will say, "Oh, it's fantastic," but this is not the genre in which we publish. You kind of think,
Yeah.
really, it's brilliant, and then you don't even want to look at it. And then, of course, there's some who say that, "I'm sorry, it doesn't meet our standard," which is like terrible. You kind of really feel small because it's saying
Yeah.
your writing is not good enough. And then each time you do that, it used to really shake my faith. Even now it does. When you send something and somebody, it's terrible, it really shakes your faith. But I think for me, I have tried to build my immunity by publishing online. I mean, on LinkedIn and all of that, which is where I do a lot of my writing. Publish every week so that, a few comments which are appreciative and a few comments which are indifferent, and some which are, which sort of do that. You build an immunity. How would you build immunity to rejection? By simply going back to your faith or going back and starting afresh?
I'll start with at the beginning, when Letters for Paul, which was my first novel, the one that I talked to you about, it received quite a lot of cruel rejections on the one hand and indifferent rejections. But what I also did was have this manuscript read by Shama Fateh Ali and also Pankaj Mishra, and they were critical of it. And Pankaj Mishra, I remember, he gave the blurb for the book, so I just value it a lot. So he did tell me a couple of things which helped me. He said, for example, it was written in the third person first, and he said, write in the first person, use I, the first person, to have more impact. And I realized that was what I was hesitating to do, because when you write in the first person, you're putting yourself out there. That's sometimes hard for a new writer to do, because you're making yourself vulnerable in more ways than one. You cannot write anything lasting or anything of impact, anything of significance, if your heart is not there, if you yourself are not there on the page. And that's actually, it's easier said than done, because you're exposing yourself in some way. No, I'm not talking about the traumatic events that have happened in your life, but how you see the world, your gaze, even that is, quite a vulnerable thing to do. You expose yourself to the world's gaze. What he said helped me do that. Those random things that people say to you, sometimes they make an impact. And even in some of the rejections, one said it was overwritten. Now, I could easily dismiss that and said, oh, this is a cruel rejection, just leave it aside. But I realized that one learns more when you learn to look at rejections and see if they really mean something to you and if you can do something with that. So if once somebody said it was overwritten, I worked at it. I went back to it and I cut down. Letters for Paul, when it finally came out, was 1/3 its original size. That's the other thing. You should learn to let go. I mean, words, what we write is very precious to us. And we think that, no, we can't cut it down or anything. But you need to also know when to let go and cut down brutally. Like somebody said, kill your darlings, that's the important thing to learn. I mean, I tried to learn from my rejections, and I've got a lot of them in this 20 years that I've been writing. I've got a lot of rejections, but I try to learn from everything. And by this time, I know when somebody is being indifferent and when somebody has really something to say. I guess I've learned to make that distinction. So it's all part of the learning curve, I guess.
You said that you write in first person. That's such a powerful piece of advice from Pankaj Mishra. Of course, he's such a fine writer. Is that the reason why so many of the first novels are autobiographical?
Probably, yes. Because when one starts writing, one begins with what we know, right? I mean, that's one of the axioms that one starts. I mean, you could write a fantasy thing like J.K. Rowling wrote the Harry Potter series or whatever. But in most cases, that helps, because you understand the world from your perspective. And that's one of the earliest advice a writer usually gets. And I guess I followed then when Kiran Nagarkar also said that, did somebody make you angry? And Pankaj Mishra's advice about moving to a first person account. Those things, I think, at least worked for me. Later on, I mean, even though I wrote in the first person, it wasn't autobiographical, but writing in the first person helps you do away with many things. Like, you don't have to waste time on unnecessary sentences, like Hans stood at the window and looked outside. You can just say, I saw all this from my window, something like, those differences help when you write in the first person.
You also went and did a MFA in Vermont, and it was like a 2-year residency.
It was a limited residency in the sense that one had to go to Vermont at Montpelier in Vermont for about 15 days every 6 months, where we had intense workshops, we had lectures and seminars where writers and poets would come from all over the US, and fantastic readings also. We had like well-known writers and poets reading from their works. And then we would get to know our mentors, the advisors, that we would choose our mentors. Like they would come and talk and give a brief spiel on what they could offer a particular student. And you would choose an advisor whose work you admired and whom you thought would be a good teacher. So that was the purpose of that 15-day residency. And for the rest of the time, for the semester of 6 months, we would work online with that mentor every month, sending packets, using the speed post or the UPS, sending 25 pages, or most of the time it was 40 pages of writing, double-spaced writing, either a story or non-fiction. I mean, I worked on my fiction. That's how it worked. And for my 4 semesters, I had 3 different mentors, which each of them brought their skills and advice, and which helped me in different ways.
What did you look for in a mentor when you were there?
This might sound controversial. Okay. No, it's an American, mainly white institution. Okay. As I think I was the only Indian student at that time. The Indian writers who have thus far made an impact in the US, Jhumpa Lahiri and others of our ilk. So try to answer this tactfully. When I write about stuff, I'll write about my background and things that I am familiar with. Not necessarily writing what I know, but things that come easily to me, things I can describe well and feel about, right? So I'll write about Bombay. More often than not, even my mentors, at least 2 out of the 3, did not know much about India, its background, its history, its immense diversity. So I had to grapple with that. The same way I used to deal with rejection, I knew that they are well-published writers, so I had to learn from them. It's not for me to tell them that what they don't know, but I should get out of them what they do know and how it will help me. So it was mainly about the craft that I learned, or I worked at a sentence level writing, get the sentence right, the bricks of writing, how to work on settings, not just the plot, but the settings, the scene, how to draw a scene, the dialogue that can enhance a plot, and how to do away with unnecessary things like overwriting and using adverbs, adjectives. One of my advisors was part Asian. So, how to write about a thing with characters from diverse backgrounds, how to create drama and tension. That was one vital thing. It's easy to talk about, but creating drama and tension and conflict in fiction and how that moves the story forward. I think basic aspects of craft is what I thought I learned during my MFA program, and hopefully that helped my writing.
Thank you. And we are today talking to Anuradha Kumar and talking about how to write, whether fiction or non-fiction. We started by looking at the huge number of novels that she's written, and then also to learn from her about how she handled rejection, how she got introduced to writing, and this whole element of the craft of writing. How do you improve your craft by chiseling away at each sentence? When you think about this whole business of improving your writing, chiseling the sentence, replacing one word with another, maybe changing the dialogues, creating a setting, creating the conflict, which is at the heart of storytelling. All of this, which of these did you find the easiest, which was the toughest, and has that changed over the years?
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I didn't find anything easy in writing. There's one ploy which I think helps me in writing fiction. Most of my fiction or non-fiction has to do with history. I realized that I love history. I always loved history. Been going to Excel, and I was a way to impress my parents. I always wanted to do a PhD in history. I realized that I love history, and most of my writing has to do with history. That's the easy thing, at least I feel, because I've been with history for so long. If I read something, I get an idea that this can be a good story. Like there's a good story here. For example, this book, The Kidnapping of Mark Twain. I was reading his book that Mark Twain wrote when he came to India in 1896. It's called Following the Equator. It's on Gutenberg. And I was reading that book because I was doing all these Bombay-related pieces for Scroll and stuff. Mark Twain's style of writing, he's so entertaining and he's such a wonderful writer. And I had come to the part, I think it was chapter 30 in his book, so more than half the book. He writes about coming to Bombay and staying at Watson's Hotel. And it was like a light bulb. Somebody switching on a light bulb in my head. Like, what if he gets kidnapped? So that's where the story was born. And I realized, this is all on hindsight, being introspective about my work, that I might not have learned enough history to offer solutions to the world's conflicts and historical conflicts, what's happening in Middle East or whatever. But I love history enough to ask the questions like what if and what now. To ask the what if questions in history has helped my historical fiction. As for writing it, I go scene by scene, like the first scene, for example, in a historical fiction like Chandragupta or Harsha, it'll begin with how I imagine a particular scene, a setting. There's the palace and the road going inside, the different parts of it, the hallway, where the light comes from, where the windows should be. The sounds, the sounds that one heard in the past are entirely different from what one hears now. There's no honking of automobiles, for example, in the past. The birds and the fox calls, the sounds of horses trotting by. So building a scene, I realized, is one way of getting into fiction, whether it's historical or even any kind of literary fiction or anything you do. That also gives shape to your characters. Yeah, because your characters are part of that scene, right? If you say there's sunlight flooding a room, automatically that gives you an impression that this can't be a scene full of conflict. It's probably a gentle scene, a romantic scene even. So that's how I work at it. First developing the scene and then trying to see how I can impact the characters. And then once you get into the shoes of your character, there's a division that I think, a dichotomy that one has to work at. How much of the author you have to leave out and let the character do the telling. And that's different because the author is not the narrator. That's fascinating. And that's one of the best things I love about being a writer, because it lets you become different personalities and different personas and what they're thinking and what they are behaving like. I can behave like a villain who hates her mother-in-law or something like that, or somebody who's plotting to take over a kingdom, and I can be this very demure young girl who's like about to lose her virginity and stuff like that. So that kind of stuff. So I find that fascinating about writing fiction, that you can become different people at different stages.
I think it lets you lead multiple lives, beyond your own. And the more vividly you can imagine that life, the more powerful your writing is.
Yeah.
When I wrote fiction, I haven't written fiction in a long time.
Yeah, I loved Mediocre but Arrogant and Married but Unavailable. I love those first two novels of yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I used to struggle to write the dialogue of female character because men speak in a certain way, women speak in a certain way. Because I remember the first time when I submitted part of a script to somebody whose work I like, not a published writer, but somebody whose writing I always thought was very powerful, which was my dad. He used to write in Bengali and I really used to admire his writing. And then he kind of read a little bit of that draft and said, there's so much of you in that particular story that all the writers sound as if you were speaking. And that was probably the biggest piece of feedback that really made me change because, and I said, how is that? So he says, first of all, the women sound like men and all the men sound like each other. And then if you think about it, the woman also sounds like as if you are speaking. I hear your voice when I read this. That was like a light bulb moment, Okay, I'm gonna go back and tear it up. So I rewrote that entire piece all over again, and but with multiple times. And so that was like really, I think, the first time I realized that how do you detach yourself from yourself to be a character? How do you do it? What is your method?
I'll go back to historical fiction. When I wrote this book on these three emperors, this Harsha thing and this Chandragupta, right? Yeah. Like everybody knows about Chandragupta, right? I mean, the Chandragupta and his association with Chanakya and all that. But here I had to focus on his life and how, from a young boy on the run, he gradually becomes this challenger to the Nandas and to become Magad's new ruler and stuff. So how do I fill in all these details? This isn't in the first person. It's actually Chandragupta's story. But the process of scene setting helped. First, working on the scene where he runs away from the Nandas, king's soldiers who are chasing him. So imagining the forest and how would it look? How do I imagine a young boy running through the forest, fighting for his life, And when I think of the situation, I can hear him breathing fast, panting, his feet, the soles of his feet, trampling over thorns, jumping over branches, evading snakes, scorpions, wading through rivers, splashing through puddles, avoiding branches, looking back once in a while, and nothing but the sounds of the forest around him, the sound of the hissing of snakes and somewhere a tiger roaring and his own harsh breathing. The accoutrements, the tangential things, they help me think about what he looked like, someone lean, thin, almost skeletal because he's been on the run for so long and his hair growing long and his piercing eyes. I mean, of course, I made him look very handsome also. So, and when I imagine this character, or the dialogue, one is writing in English, that's one thing. And this is about a king who lived about, how long ago? 2000 BC, right? So 2500 years ago. So the dialogue had to be sufficiently pithy and also smart and spunky. So one had to make adjustments with that, not sound like one of those. If you see any book from about 100 years ago, the dialogue style is very archaic and it doesn't work. Work constantly at the dialogue, at the setting. I guess it sounds very easy when I'm talking about it. I probably must have revised it about 10-12 times before it finally became Chandragupta, the book. And my editor, I had a pretty good editor in Heshet who was very strict. Sometimes I really got upset with her. In the end, her criticisms of the book actually helped me write it well. And I mean, it's one of the books I'm happy about. I mean, not too much of my writing I'm happy about, but this is one of the books that I was happy about. So rewriting it, revising it at least 12 times thoroughly. I mean, not just not looking at track changes and revising, but revising it thoroughly, rewriting it. That's what helped finally the book come into shape. Yeah.
It's just so fascinating it made me sort of reflect on the way you talked about describing the character running through the forest, the sound of the heartbeat, the sound of breathing, and the roar of the tiger in the distance. And good writing actually appeals to all your senses, what you are seeing, what you're hearing, what you are experiencing in outside of you, inside of you, but not overdoing it. Actually, that's why it is a craft, that it is there and there's a structure to it and there is no structure to it. So it is walking in this twilight zone, which is what makes writing such a interesting as well as extremely challenging.
Yeah.
The other question I've always wanted to ask writers, and I always ask them, how do you know that a piece of work is finished? And the reason why I'm asking that is, as soon as I've submitted the manuscript, of course, the editors will come back to you and ask for revisions and all. You've done that. And they say it is now going to press. My first reaction is, I think the book needs substantial rewriting.
Yeah, I know. Yeah.
And you kind of think that, no, this is not ready. And they will always say, no, now we are done and this is going to go ahead. And they make some cosmetic changes and then you kind of think that, oh my God, I mean, this is like terrible. And so you kind of try and do another few little scratches in the next proof or whatever. And I always go back thinking, oh my God, I mean, did I submit it prematurely? Was I just being very ambitious? I said, let's get this is done. When I'm writing it, I feel very confident that it's good. As soon as I submit it, I feel completely sure, equally sure that it's terrible. What is your experience of that?
Yeah, I suppose I can relate so much to what you're saying. I look at it at the proof stage and then it's gone. And immediately after I hold the copy in my hands, I get very nervous. I don't want to look at it. Right? I know for sure that there's some things I've missed and it's going to like show up glaringly when I look at it. So I'm very scared to look at the advanced copy when it comes. I think I take at least 6 months before I can look at the published work because I'm actually very nervous. But how do I know it's finished? I really don't know because I try to revise a piece at least 5-6 times. And then if I'm lucky to work with really good editors, I know that they'll help me with what they suggest. For example, in this kidnapping of Mark Twain, I mean, even though I had taken it through about to 7 drafts or something, there was this one particular word I kept using over and over again. It totally slipped me. Like I think I must have used the word flushed, like going red in the face, flushed at least 9 times. When I went through it at the PDF stage, when they send you the proofs back, I realized to my horror I've done this. Because those things, that's the irritating thing about one's mistakes. They come and leap out at you when you least expect it. So luckily one could tweak that at that stage. But I'm always afraid of those kind of things happening when you hold the advanced copy in your hand. So that's one thing I'm still very nervous about. One way is to just revise it as much as possible. But that's one of my nightmares, waking up and thinking, oh my God, I've done this.
The process of writing helps you grow. My big motivation to write is also that it's a way of growing. One of the ways it gets reflected is that when you look at what you've written, I mean, obviously, when you write 60,000 words or 100,000 words or whatever the size of your novel is, during that process, the time that has elapsed and you've written and refined yourself and you thought harder and you've done a second draft, and this whole process, actually you evolve in that whole process.
Yeah.
It's not therefore surprising when you look back, you immediately look at it and say, my God, that's now I need to write another one to make up for that, because people must really think that it's horrible, and then you go back and write more. I also noticed that you've done, for example, you've written about Chandragupta and you've written about Chanakya and you've written about a tiger and all of that. I mean, so do you kind of construct your writing in terms of multiple books in your head that, okay, this is a side gig that I will do later. This is the main book. I should focus on this, and I'm going to come out and write about Chanakya at another point of time. For example, I also saw that you've written about the women in the freedom movement, and you've written about Sarojini Naidu. Is that how you kind of look at it, that, you are writing about a whole range of characters and one of them strikes out as, or do you write about Sarojini Naidu first and then you kind of say, what about other writers or other women in the freedom movement?
No, that's interesting because let me tell you, the non-fiction books that I've done for younger readers, like Sarojini Naidu or this book Kings and Queens or In the Country of Gold Digging Ants, most of them were commissioned books. Like my editors at Hachette Penguin, they asked me to do these books because they thought, at least one of them told me that I don't like beating my own trumpet like this. One of them told me that I seem to understand history well and explain it to younger readers. Those days I wasn't getting many compliments, so I took that to heart. So some of the non-fiction books for younger readers, and I think I've done about 15 or 20 of them. Most of them are commissioned. My editors asked me to work on them. So the book on Chanakya, Sarojini Naidu, and the book called Her Name Was Freedom, about the women who were involved in India's freedom struggle. I was asked to do them by my editors, but my background in history helped, Yeah, that's How Did Harappans Say Hello, that my editor at Puffin suggested. Across the Seven Seas was actually one of my own ideas. So it's a mix of both. But again, most of them have been commissioned books. My background in history helped me look at the right sources, the sources that actually would help me tell their story and what I could glean from these sources. There are a lot of these hagiographical books that don't tell you the complete story, books that are written badly. I had the discretion, which I hopefully picked up in this long years, of studying history and working with history. Because my editors trusted me, I did those books, and that trust helped me bring out these books. The non-fictional books for older readers and even the fictional books mainly involving history, those I worked entirely with an idea in mind, like the Mark Twain book, which is historical fiction. There's another non-fictional book for older readers that I've done, which is about early Indians in America, which takes off on some of my scroll pieces. It's my love for history which helps me come up with these ideas, the what ifs and what then or what could have happened. Asking those questions helped me come up with ideas. So basically, I would say that I love history enough to ask these questions about the past, and which in turn gives me these ideas. I think I'm about to I finally got what you're asking, your question about when I'm working on a book and then suddenly an idea strikes me that this could be a separate story in itself. I just put it down somewhere. I have this drafts folder in my laptop somewhere. So I put down this idea that I'll come back to it. But I work on the main thing that I'm doing and it stays in my mind, and hopefully, believe it or not, I have about 495 outlines. Then it's just just 2 or 3 sentences. I haven't worked on any of them, but it's just nice to think that, if ever I get that, probably I'll never have a writer's block because I can go to one of these ideas and work on them. When I was working on this Mark Twain book, I had 1-2 ideas that were based on these characters who came up in this novel, and I put them away safely. It's another story that I'll never probably go back to them, but it makes me feel good that I'm doing something okay as a writer, probably.
That's so brilliant. And I love the way you kind of mentioned very casually, I've written those 15, 20 books. There's a big difference between 15 and 20, and that is so intimidating for somebody like me to say, 15, 20 books, I've got a long way to go, and suddenly brings out the competitive streak and say that. How long do you take to write a book?
Earlier I used to, but that was a mistake, I think, because you have to shift personas while working on different books. I think I was trying to tell you that I have seen 2 phases in my writing life. One is the pre-2013 and one is post-2013. When I really took myself seriously as a writer. Actually, I was younger, so to be fair to myself, I was to think, ye kitab nikal gaya. It looks so good and to have reviews about it. But I think post-2013, I realized it's important to write a good book just for that book's sake. That, you're doing something for the world, trying to make the world happy in a small way. It's up to each one of us to do that, to fill the world in some way. You're trying to look for those readers who will feel happy when they're reading your book, happy or moved in some way, to make the reader think differently. To answer your question, these days, actually, I don't. And when I have 2 deadlines, I somehow manage to, plead with the other editor that give me some more time and all that. And sometimes they listen. More often than do listen, actually. So I try to work on one thing at a time. And I write every day, almost every day. I mean, it doesn't work when I'm traveling or like when I was in India for a bit or when it's Sundays or whatever. It's not that consciously I set apart Sundays as a Sabbath day or something like that. No, but I try to write every day, at least 1,000 words. Obviously, the first draft is bad. It's really bad. But I write just to keep up the practice. I always, I'm scared that if I don't write, I'll forget everything. I'll forget how to do it. And I certainly read every day. Something, either a long essay or something from a book or a short story. Sometimes I think I miss out on other things. Like, I think to get a sense of the dialogue, to get a sense of how dialogue is spoken these days, one should actually, look at the latest Netflix series or something, because how to get a sense of contemporary speech or contemporary relationships, it always helps to do that. But I prefer reading books than watching something. I try to remedy that, but so far it's not worked, I think. But that's one thing I should look at, how to do the dialogue stuff, especially in today's generation. I mean, I can't keep asking my daughter for ideas and all that. She gets irritated. But still, yeah.
What's it like to have a writer as a mom?
Oh, terrible. I mean, that's a very searing question. I mean, I know a lot of writers have written about it, women writers, like Rachel Cusk and others. To be very honest and to be very frank, sometimes I'm torn apart. As a mother, obviously, I mean, I try to balance it. And most times I think I've failed. And as a writer, you are, toying with other things. So there's other challenges. You live in different worlds at most of the time. And then you have to also think about the present. So it's a constant conflict and it's a constant challenge, especially living in America, where as an Asian writer, you're automatically sorted as a person of color, as a minority writer. And the things that you write do not necessarily get the readership here, because you're only supposed to write about certain kinds of things. And I have to be honest, I write about what I feel best about. So I've been trying to express that to my daughter, who's very much, growing up here in the present among American friends. That challenge, and that there's always some heartbreak, there's conflict, but one tries. I mean, that's life after all.
When you started to publish, you talked about the first one was self-published with Writers Workshop. And by the way, I think Writers Workshop is responsible for launching so many writers.
Yeah.
The typical sort of book cover that they had, I was so distinctive. Somebody, when they self-publish, they sometimes think that it's inferior to have a self-published book as compared to, let's say, being published by one of the recognized publishing houses. Do you feel the same way?
Writers Workshop was a different thing. I think because there were very few publishers at that time. I don't think Writers Workshop comes out with many books now. Professor Lal had a stature of his own. But right now, I think there are far too many publishers. There are some really good ones, and then some who are just, finding that space. To be validated as a writer, to find your readers, I think it's worth it to look for a good publisher.
Why look for a good publisher?
Because the editing process is more streamlined. You know that you'll be in the hands of a capable, competent editor. And also the thing about marketing and projecting your own book, publicizing, they'll take care of it. Okay. But let me tell you, even the independent publishers here in the US, they're very small and very good ones. But most of them, they expect you to do your own publicity and all that. And writers being inherently introverted, that becomes a bit of a challenge. So a big publisher automatically takes care of that. But the challenge is you do need an agent these days, a literary agent, to put your stuff before publishers. And I think every author should try and get an agent. And to get noticed by an agent, you should try and, publish. If you get published in a lot of literary magazines also, in the US, even to have your Substack or whatever. Try to make your own a unique niche in some field or something. Like, you would be a good writer to follow, I think, for anybody from the HR field trying to write. I would recommend them to follow you instantly. So, yeah.
How generous of you. Thank you. We are at the top of the hour. It's just been absolutely phenomenal to, see the number of things that you've done in your life. The sheer breadth of writing that you've done. It's so admirable. I just got fascinated with your candor and your insights. And I hope that as people connect with you on Facebook and Twitter, I have shared your links. I hope that you will continue to inspire many more writers. And, I certainly look forward to reading your latest book and catch up on some of the others that I have not heard of, but I am going to read them. I'm going to find them and read them. So thank you so very much for being here on the show. And thank you for inspiring many more writers and sharing your craft. Thanks a million.
No, thank you, Abhijit. It was lovely talking to you and learning so much from you in turn. I think your questions were really helpful. I'll get careers. I think I have Dreamers and Unicorns and your first 2 fiction books, but I'll get careers. Yeah.
Please. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.